The Tag-Along. Scary Asian horror movie or my favorite Girl Scout cookie? Possibly both. Welcome to Rotted, review of the day. Today we're going to be taking a look at the 2015 movie from Taiwan, The Tag-Along. Those of you that have watched my movie review of The Haunted House Project know that I have a very deep love of Asian horror, but to my knowledge, I have never seen a horror movie from Taiwan. And I don't really know exactly why that is. I've, Thailand, China, Japan, Korea, a lot of Korean, all over the place, but never Taiwan. I don't really have a particularly, good reason for that. I just never happened to come across any. But I did have the opportunity to come across this one, and I jumped onto it. So, as always, this normal review is going to be spoiler free. If you haven't seen the movie, I'm not going to reveal anything that is considered a spoiler or a terrible reveal. There will be an accompanying video that will be a deep dive, spoiler filled discussion coming out the same day. But for right now, we're just going to go ahead and get right into the scoring. And as always, we have 5 different categories that we're going to be scoring up to 20 points each for a total possible score of 100 points. So let's just go ahead and jump right into that. First of all, the plot and subtext. Now, I want to get into, in the deep dive discussion, a lot of overwhelming differences between American and Asian horror cinema, especially in terms of plot and storyline, because there are some massive differences. And I want to grade this fairly. I can't really judge this based on American culture. I have to kind of judge it on its own merits. Even so, the plot for me, I thought, was somewhat solid. It had a fairly decent mythos. It didn't explore it to the nth degree and grind it into the ground. As far as subtext goes, I think this is where I have to kind of take some points off. And the reason for that is not because it didn't have subtext, it's because it had too much. And I'm not talking about a movie like Mother, where the entire thing was metaphorical or symbolic. I'm talking about the fact that it dealt with grief and guilt and abortion and nature and deforestry, and just it dealt with too much as well. My favorite thing about horror films is the fact that the horror element of it is typically not the storyline. It is typically the catalyst for telling a story, for telling character flaws and terrible traits of humanity and how they relate to our protagonists. And the horror is the vehicle to get them on that storytelling path. And in this case, this wasn't a vehicle, this was a convoy. And it dealt with so many different things that I think the subtext and what they were going for in the aspects of humanity it was trying to shine a light on, that it got muddled, and ultimately I had to judge it based on that. So I gave this a 13 out of 20 possible points. It was a decent story, just tried to tackle too much, and I had to mark it down for that. Intent. Intent on this one, I really had a little bit of a tough time with, just because I really had a bit of a difficulty nailing down what I thought the intent was. And having watched it, the best I could really come up with as far as a summary would be to that the intent was to do a story based on an existing superstition, mythos, a cultural, a cultural mythos, to wrap a story of 2, maybe 3 centralized characters around it, and make it a scary endeavor while it did it. On that note, I think that it did fairly well, and mythos is one of the big things that I want to tackle in the deep dive discussion, because that is one of the big things that sets Asian horror apart from horror anywhere else in the world, especially America, and how it tackles mythos. Yeah, I thought that it was fairly decently scary. It tried way too much for jump scares, and ultimately I think only two of them worked. And I'm going to be getting into that with the fear quotient at the last category there. But even so, if its intent was to be scary, I have to kind of mark it down for having so many failed attempts on the jump scares. So I marked this as a 14 out of 20. Decent mythos, decent storytelling, decent characters. The scares were a little lackluster, and the methodology of the storytelling was using a particular tool in the toolbox that I think was overused. And again, deep dive discussion. I don't want to give away spoilers, but that's just my general opinion, and I will be going over it. Acting is the category that is graded the highest. I gave this a 16 out of 20. And I thought that the performances that everybody did was very, very good. It dealt with a lot of things besides just, look at the camera and be scared. It dealt with grief, terrible sadness, loss, melancholy, but the acting shone through in those performances, and a lot of those are similar traits. Grief, loss, melancholy, sadness. They're very similar, but there are subtle differences, and those subtle differences did come through in the performances when each aspect was tackled. And I have to give it some pretty high marks for that alone. The way that the characters didn't just treat the other characters, but treated the entire relationship that they had historically with those characters, I thought was phenomenal. It had a young man, his girlfriend, and his grandmother who raised him, and the way that he treated his grandmother on surface level, and the way that he remembered his grandmother throughout the film, and the dichotomy between those, the similarities and the differences between those two aspects, both how he treated her and what he thought of her, I thought was brilliantly performed. And the same goes with the girlfriend and the boyfriend. So, yeah, high marks on the acting. I had to give it some major kudos for that. Unfortunately, the effects, I have to mark it down for this. The effects, I use this term probably too much, tools in the toolbox, and I usually use it in the world of effects when it comes to CGI versus practical effects. A lot of people that are lovers of sci-fi, fantasy, and horror, they have some pretty strong opinions about the prevalent uses of CGI, and a little bit less as time goes on just because it gets so much better refined. For me, I don't have any problem with CG being in a movie as long as it's well done and as long as it has a place for it. When you're a carpenter, you want to use the right tool for the right job at the right moment, and when you do it, you want to do it the right way. For me, CG, computer graphics, is just another tool in the toolbox of a filmmaker, and you want to use it at the right time, and you want to use it the right way. And I argue on both of those points for this movie. The primary antagonist could have very easily been done with practical effects, and instead they chose a computer-generated model. And I think that they did go practical effects in some closer-up shots, but the full body movement shots were definitely CG, and there's no excuse for them being as bad as they were. Totally took me out of it and made something that could have been genuinely scary a little bit laughable. So I marked it down for that, 10 out of 20 for that. Aside from the antagonist, the effects were actually fairly decent. The blood effects, there was some scenes in there with some insects and so forth. There were other aspects of it that I thought were solid, but I cannot overlook the primary antagonist looking that bad. So 10 out of 20 for effects. And lastly, the fear quotient. Again, the movie relied a lot on jump scares, and there were only 2 instances, and I made sure to count them, that actually made me jump. The rest of it relied on creepiness and a general air of suspense. And on that note, I thought it succeeded. So, where to judge this one? I wound up doing it 12 out of 20. I thought the fear quotient was decent. It did not shake me to the, core, and it's certainly not going to stay with me. But I thought it was decent enough. It did genuinely make me jump twice. Those it earned. And the suspenseful, creepy moments I thought were well done. So 12 out of 20 for that, which brings us to a total possible score of 65 points. Pretty decent. Overall, not terrible. I would recommend it for fans of Asian horror. If you don't know whether you like Asian horror or not, I think this is a pretty good one to just give a whirl and see what you think. It's not, it doesn't fall into a lot of the issues that a lot of Asian horror does with delving too deep into the mythos, and again, deep dive discussion. And it stays on its own tracks fairly well. So I think this is actually a pretty good one to start with. If you don't know whether you like Asian horror or not, this is a good one. For those of you that do and accept the cultural differences contained therein, I think that this is a pretty phenomenal one. It, in the entire world of filmmaking and horror movies, I thought it was okay. Certainly not something to avoid. So, that's about it for this one. Look for it in the deep dive discussion because I'm going to be going into a lot there. It's probably actually going to be a bit of a longer video than typical. So anyway, that's the tag along. And next time you want to watch a horror movie, first make sure that it's good and rotted.